Rabbi Paltiel, how can we understand that Rambam's view in Nevuchim, Chelik Gimel, Perek Yud Gimel, section 3, chapter 13, where he argues that the universe does not exist solely for humanity? So the question that's being asked is, how do we reconcile, how do we juxtapose the Rambam's idea that the universe is not just for humanity with the Chassidic understanding of Dira B'Tachtenim, which sees humanity as the central entity to revealing godliness in the lower realms? And of course the question is, did the Rambam's view a shift from the anthropocentric tachlis, or the anthropic-centric tachlis, to a sort of avodas habirudim framework where humans are not the tachas abriya by themselves, but rather mere kelim through which Ein Sof is drawn into the world? I want to read your words exactly. Is that Rambam's view a shift from an anthropocentric tachlis to a sort of avodas habirudim framework where humans are not the tachas abriya in a self-serving sense, or I would, instead of self-serving, I'd probably use the word a self-graduating or a strictly anthropic purpose, but rather kelim through which Ein Sof is drawn into the world? What am I missing? Please feel free to refer me to any sources or lectures of yours that may have covered this more specifically. You've been very helpful in guiding clarity thus far, and this is greatly appreciated. Then he writes, thank you. I'm doing this as a Q&A, so I'm not going to say your name. I cannot answer this question directly. I need to give you a little bit of background. And the first thing I need to tell you is this. I don't encourage people to learn Moreh Nevuchim. Not so much because the Moreh Nevuchim is a problem, but because people are a problem. To learn the Moreh Nevuchim, you have to be very, very dedicated. You can't read it. You have to study it intently and intensely, and you have to be very focused. The Rambam did not write an easy book. He just wrote a book that reads easy, but it's a very, very deep book. And I find that people read it casually, and they sort of think they figured it out, and they just, besides for the fact that there's all kinds of questions that the Moreh Nevuchim raises vis-a-vis Chassidus, they simply do not give him the respect that he deserves to learn him with the earnestness and dedication that the Moreh Nevuchim should be learned. So I really don't encourage people to learn it. Although in the Chassidus, the Rebbe seems to call the Moreh Nevuchim Shava L'chol Nefesh, although historically it's a very controversial thing. The most important thing about learning Moreh Nevuchim is you cannot learn Moreh Nevuchim as a corollary. You cannot learn Moreh Nevuchim and compare it to any other body of knowledge. You have to learn it as a body unto itself. If you choose to learn Moreh Nevuchim, you're learning only Moreh Nevuchim. You want to get into the Rambam's head, you want to understand how he thinks, what his philosophy is, what the foundational ideas of his philosophy are, what the axioms that precede his philosophy is, and learn it as an entity unto itself. If you complete learning the Moreh Nevuchim, and you've learned it thoroughly enough that you have a sense of how he thinks, you can first begin the exercise of trying to juxtapose it, to compare it and contrast it with other Chalkei HaTorah. And of course they're different. They're different for foundational reasons, for fundamental reasons, and they're also different for secondary reasons. In other words, differences of opinion. But it's a terrible error to learn every Perek of Moreh Nevuchim and say, well, what does Chassidus say and how does that work? You have to assume that the Rambam is going to say something different than everything, and he does. Because the Rambam is in the box of philosophy, and Chassidus is outside the box of philosophy. They're two very, very different systems of logic with very different criteria. Okay? So that's the first thing. You have to learn the Rambam by itself. You can learn Chassidus and learn Rambam, but you can't compare them until you've learned enough of the Rambam to know how he thinks and to assume that he thinks differently than the Maimorim, and then you could perhaps attempt to compare and contrast what says in Moreh Nevuchim to Chassidus, although that itself may end up with so much confusion that it may not even be worth it. Now, as far as the point you're raising, there's two separate questions. The first question is, what's the purpose of creation? And the second question is, what's the purpose of creation as it relates to Hashem? And that's really the biggest difference between the Rambam and Chassidus. Because the Rambam does not really hold that the purpose of creation serves Hashem. The Rambam holds that the purpose of creation serves the creation. There is this classic question, which in the Maimonides Chassidus, it's the sugya of Va'avadatem Hashem Elokechem, which is a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim. And of course, you know it as the Maimonides Mishakela from Tav Shin Yud Beis, but there's many Maimonim on that theme. where the Rebbe raises a question that's found in the Sefer Avodas HaKodesh, which is called Avodah Tzorech Gavoya. And Avodah Tzorech Gavoya is a Hebrew phrase which can either be written with a question mark or as a statement. The statement of Avodah Tzorech Gavoya you can find in the Ramban. That's how far back it goes in Parshas Tetzaveh someplace. But of course in Kabbalah it becomes a big issue. And the philosophers, that means people like the Rambam, would say those three words, B'tmiya Avodah Tzorech Gavoya, the work we do matters to Hashem. And that question is a rhetoric. It's not a question that has an answer. It's a question that remains a fact. They would bring the Mamoreh Chazal that say, to God it makes no difference. And they would argue, based on the principles that you see in some schools of thought in Musar, the whole creation is only for us. So the question that you asked needs to be clarified, because the Rambam doesn't hold that Hashem gains anything out of the creation. The Rambam holds that the creation gains something out of the creation. And he created it because he wants to be kind. As you'll see later on in the third section, when he gets to Tamiyah Mitzvahs, that idea is going to become clearer and clearer, that the Rambam does not hold that Hashem benefits from the creation. So the difference between the Rambam and Chassidus is not just what's the purpose, but whether there is a purpose vis-a-vis God. We hold, Chassidus holds, Kabbalah holds, Avodah Tzorech Gavoya, that the work we do benefits HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in Kabbalah, Avodah Tzorech Gavoya means Atzilus, it means Elokus, not Elokah. And Chassidus would take it a step further and say Avodah Tzorech Gavoya means even Atzmus. Even Hashem himself benefits from our mitzvahs, although you can't explain that logically, you can only explain that on a level which is above logic. So the difference between the Rambam's concept of the purpose and our concept of the purpose is not just what's the purpose is, but who does the purpose serve? In the Rambam's world, the purpose of creation serves the creation. That's it. In Chassidus' purpose, worldview, the purpose of creation serves Hashem. So therefore, a little bit your question is apples and oranges. Chassidus is speaking about Dira B'Tachtenim for Hashem. The Rambam is speaking of the purpose of creation, and he's including more than people in that purpose. And I'm going to explain to you soon what the Rambam holds, and you'll realize that it's not as broad as you think. It's actually quite narrow, predicated on the presumption that the purpose of creation is for the creation and not for the creator. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to make a second segment for this Q&A.